Hello, boring dreamers. Today we are stepping off the edge of the modern map and sailing straight into the glittering, dangerous heart of the ancient Mediterranean. We are going to walk the marble halls of Cleopatra's Alexandria, a place where the perfume is thick enough to choke you, and the wine is almost certainly spiked with something lethal. You see the movies with the golden barges and the romance, but let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. The court of the Ptolemies is less like a luxury resort and more like a Shark Tank with better interior design. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, go ahead and let me know in the comments where you're re-watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing on the swaying deck of a merchant galley, the wood beneath your sandals, warm from the mid-morning sun. The air tastes of salt spray and the faint, sweet decay of the Nile Delta mixing with the sea. Ahead of you, the horizon is dominated not by land, but by a star that has seemingly fallen to earth. It is a piercing, white-hot light that forces you to shield your eyes, even though it's broad daylight. This is your first introduction to Alexandria, and it is designed to make you feel small, insignificant, and entirely watched. You are looking at the Pharos, the great lighthouse, and it is less a navigational aid and more a statement of absolute, crushing power. As your ship cuts through the turquoise water of the great harbor, the scale of the structure becomes terrifyingly clear. It rises from the eastern tip of the island of Pharos like a limestone mountain carved by geometry. It stands over 300 feet tall, a stack of blinding white stone that transitions from a square base to an octagonal midsection, finally tapering to a cylindrical pinnacle. A mainstream historical fact, you might recall, is that this was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and for good reason. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world for centuries, second only to the Great Pyramids of Giza. But while the pyramids are tombs for the dead, this is a machine for the living. It screams that the dynasty ruling this city has mastered engineering, gravity, and light itself. You lean over the rail, squinting against the glare. The light isn't coming from a fire, not yet. Anyway, that's for the night. Right now, the blinding flash is coming from a massive mirror system installed at the summit. This isn't your bathroom vanity mirror. It is a marvel of polished bronze, or perhaps glass-backed metal, concave and perfectly calibrated to catch the sun's rays and hurl them miles out to sea. It feels invasive, like a spotlight tracking your approach. You feel a bead of sweat trickle down your neck, and it's not just from the Egyptian heat. You realize that you aren't just arriving. You are being scanned. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that circulated among ancient travelers and medieval Arab writers that claimed this mirror was so scientifically advanced it could actually be used as a weapon. The legend goes that the mirror could focus the sun's rays into a concentrated beam capable of burning enemy ships before they even reached the harbor, a sort of Archimedes' death ray on steroids. While that is likely a myth born of awe and fear, looking at that searing point of light, you can absolutely believe it. It feels like the eye of a god is burning a hole in your tunic. Other stories claimed the mirror acted as a telescope, allowing the guards to spot ships sailing from Constantinople long before they broke the horizon. Whether it's a death ray or a telescope, the message is the same. They saw you coming hours ago. As your ship glides past the breakwater, you enter the shadow of the beast. The noise of the city hits you, a roar of voices, the creaking of cranes, the snapping of sails. Alexandria is not a quiet desert ruin. It is the New York City of the ancient world, a metropolis of 500,000 people crammed into a grid of limestone and marble. But don't let the bustle fool you. This entry point is a chokehold. The harbor is shaped in such a way that ships are funneled into specific zones. Right under the nose of the Royal Palace complex, that occupies the Lokius promontory. You notice that the lighthouse isn't just a pretty statue. It is a fortress. There are soldiers visible on the ramparts of the square base, their armor glinting. They aren't waving hello. The Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that Cleopatra belongs to, are obsessed with control. They are foreign pharaohs ruling over a native Egyptian population, and they are deeply paranoid. The Pharos is their watchtower. Historians still argue whether the lighthouse was purely a benevolent gift to sailors to navigate the treacherous coastline, or if it was primarily a military installation designed to monitor traffic and ensure that no one entered or left the capital without the crown knowing about it. Judging by the spear-carrying guards watching your ship dock, you're leaning toward the military installation theory. The ship bumps against the stone quay with a heavy thud. Ropes are thrown. You are ushered down the gangplank, not onto dirt, but onto paved limestone. The wealth here is staggering, but so is the bureaucracy. You are immediately intercepted by customs officials. These aren't the sleepy guys stamping passports. These are agents of the DOX, the finance minister. They want to know what you're carrying, where you're from, and what your business is. Ptolemaic Egypt operates a command economy so strict that the government controls everything from the price of oil to the sewing of papyrus. You feel the weight of the state pressing down on you instantly. You try to look casual, blending in with the crowd of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Syrians that floods the docks. You look up toward the palace quarter, the Bruchion. It glimmers in the distance, a sprawling city within a city of gardens, colonnades, and villas. That is where Cleopatra lives. That is where the power is. But to get there, you have to survive the streets. And as you step away from the water, the blinding light of the Pharos still pricking at the back of your neck, you realize that the lighthouse wasn't warning you about the rocks in the water. It was warning you about the sharks on the land. The air here is thick, humid, and smells of exotic spices, masking the scent of open drains. You adjust your bag, keeping it close to your chest. You have arrived in the most magnificent city on earth, but you feel less like a tourist and more like a specimen in a jar. The light of the Pharos has marked you. You are in the system now. And as you turn your back on the sea and face the grid of streets stretching out before you, you realize that the blinding light was the only clear thing you're going to see for a while. Everything else from this point on is going to be smoke, mirrors, and shadows. You step away from the bureaucratic chokehold of the harbor and onto solid ground, turning your back on the sea. You are immediately swallowed by the city. If the lighthouse was a statement of order and geometry, the streets of Alexandria are a statement of chaos and kinetic energy. You are standing on the Canopic Way, the main artery of the city. It is a marvel of urban planning, a limestone-paved boulevard stretching nearly 100 feet wide, broad enough for 8 chariots to drive abreast without clipping wheels. It cuts a straight line from the gate of the sun in the east to the gate of the moon in the west, a distance of nearly 4 miles. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that Alexandria was one of the first cities in the world to be laid out on a perfect grid system. Designed by Alexander the Great's personal architect, Dinocrates of Rhodes, It looks rational. It looks logical. It looks like a city where everything makes sense. But as you navigate the crowd getting jostled by a man carrying a basket of figs and nearly trampled by a litter carried by sweating slaves, you realize the grid is just a container for a population that refuses to be contained. The noise is a physical wall. It's a polyphonic roar of Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, and Latin, all shouting over each other. You are surrounded by the most diverse population in the ancient world, and they all seem to be in a bad mood. The heat radiating off the white stone pavement is intense, creating shimmering mirages at knee height. You wipe sweat from your forehead, wishing you had one of those wide-brimmed straw hats the laborers wear, but you're stuck in your travel clothes, sticking out like a sore thumb. You try to walk casually, but the rhythm of the street is aggressive. People don't walk here. They march. They push. There is a palpable tension in the air, a static charge that raises the hair on your arms. You pass a street corner where a rhetorician, a public speaker, is standing on a crate, shouting about the price of grain. A crowd has gathered, not to listen politely, but to heckle. They are throwing rotten vegetables and shouting insults that are shockingly creative. This brings us to the terrifying reality of the Alexandrian mob. This isn't just a crowd. It is a political entity with a history of extreme violence. The citizens of Alexandria are famous throughout the Mediterranean for their sharp tongues, their biting satire, and their willingness to riot at the drop of a hat. They don't just protest. They lay siege to the palace. They drag unpopular ministers through the streets. They are the fourth branch of government, and their vote is cast with cobblestones. A quirky, fringe tidbit that captures this spirit is the Alexandrian habit of giving their rulers devastatingly insulting nicknames. They didn't call the Ptolemies by their royal titles. They called them things like Physken, Potbelly, Auletes, the flute player, or Cox, the Scarlet. Imagine an entire city trolling their absolute monarch to his face. It's funny in a history book, but standing here, watching the vein bulge in a soldier's neck, as a teenager screams an insult about the queen as nose, it feels incredibly dangerous. You realize that the veneer of civilization here is thinner than the gold leaf on a mummy case. You skirt the edge of the crowd, trying to make yourself invisible. You witness a dispute break out between a Greek merchant and an Egyptian priest over right-of-way. In seconds, it escalates. The merchant shoves the priest. The priest spits. Suddenly, 50 people are involved. Stones are flying. You duck into a doorway, heart hammering against your ribs. This is the Alexandrian character ancient writers warned about: volatile, passionate, and prone to stasis or civil strife. Historians still argue whether this volatility was driven primarily by ethnic tension between the privileged Greeks and the disenfranchised native Egyptians, or if it was more about economic class warfare that transcended race. Some scholars suggest the city was strictly segregated into quarters: the royal quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Egyptian district, while others argue the boundaries were fluid and the riots were just the result of too many people living in a pressure cooker. Watching a fistfight break out over a spilled jar of olive oil, you decide the specific sociological cause doesn't matter as much as the fact that you need to get out of the blast zone. You press on, moving deeper into the city. The architecture is stunning rows of colonnades, providing shade, fountains splashing cooling water, but you can't enjoy it. You have to keep your head on a swivel. You pass the gymnasium, the cultural heart of the Greek elite. Young men are wrestling and discussing philosophy, stripped naked and glistening with oil. It looks idyllic, but the gymnasium is also a hotbed of political radicalism. These aren't just jocks. They are the future leaders of the mobs. They are the ones who write the satires and organize the street gangs. As you walk, you notice something unsettling about the rooftops. They are flat, which is standard for the climate, but many of them are piled with stones. Not building materials ammo. The citizens keep stockpiles of rocks on their roofs, specifically for throwing down its soldiers during uprisings. It's a city pre-packed for civil war. You find yourself walking in the exact center of the street, as far away from the buildings as possible, trying to avoid being the target of a rooftop sniper practice session. The smell of the city shifts as you move. The salty sea air is replaced by the scent of roasting chickpeas, heavy incense, and the faint, metallic tongue of copper from the workshops. It's sensory overload. You feel a strange kind of exhaustion setting in the fatigue of constant vigilance. You aren't just walking. You are navigating a minefield of social cues you don't understand. Did you look at that woman too long? Did you fail to bow to that statue? Every interaction feels like it could spark a riot. You need to get to the palace. The Bruchion. Surely, behind the high walls of the royal quarter, there is order. Surely, the queen keeps the chaos of the streets at bay. You spot the great limestone walls in the distance, rising above the tile roofs like a cliff face. They look impenetrable. They look safe. You hurry towards them, dodging a cart drawn by 2 oxen that seem entirely unbothered by the screaming match happening next. You stand before the towering gates of the Bruchion, the royal quarter. The roar of the Alexandrian mob has faded into a dull, distant hum, replaced by a silence that feels heavy and metallic. You might think you've reached safety. You might think that crossing this threshold means you are under the protection of the Queen's law. But as you look up at the men barring your path, you realize that the danger hasn't disappeared. It has just put on a uniform. These are not the local police. They aren't even the standard Ptolemaic army. These are the Gabiniani. You look at the guard nearest to you. He is leaning against a fluted column with a casual arrogance that makes your stomach turn. He's wearing a Roman-style breastplate, but is scuffed and modified with local touches. Perhaps a linen scarf wrapped around his neck to catch the sweat, or a curved Thracian dagger tucked into his belt alongside the standard Roman gladius. He doesn't look like a disciplined legionary, fresh from the parade ground. He looks like a man who has forgotten what Rome looks like. He looks like a wolf who has realized that the sheep pen is unlocked and the shepherd is asleep. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that these men are the remnants of a Roman garrison left behind by the General Aulus Gabinius. Years ago, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, the flute player, was exiled by his own angry subjects. He bribed the Romans to put him back on the throne. Gabinius did the job, marched back to Rome, but left behind about 2,000 soldiers, including Gallic and Germanic cavalry, to make sure the king stayed alive. These men never went home. They stayed, they settled, and they mutated into something terrifying. The guard pushes off the column and steps into your personal space. He smells of stale wine, garlic, and old leather. He speaks to you in a pidgin dialect, a mashup of Latin, Greek, and Egyptian that sounds like rocks grinding together. He isn't asking for your passport. He is assessing your net worth. You realize with a jolt that the royal palace isn't guarded by patriots. It is guarded by mercenaries who have gone rogue. The Gabiniani are famous or infamous for going native, but in the worst possible way. They realized quickly that in Alexandria, the soldiers held the real power. They essentially formed a mafia within the palace walls. A quirky fringe tidbit that illustrates just how out of control they were involves the sons of the Roman governor of Syria, Marcus Bibulus. When Bibulus sent his 2 sons to Alexandria to ask the Gabiniani to come help fight the Parthians, the soldiers didn't salute. They didn't pack their bags. They murdered the 2 boys. Why? Because they liked their cushy life in Egypt and didn't want to be redeployed. And guess what? No one was punished. Cleopatra's father was so terrified of his own guards that he just sent the bodies back to Bibulus in jars and said, "Sorry, this is the force that is currently deciding whether to let you in or stab you for sport." The guard runs a calloused hand over your travel bag. He smiles, but it doesn't reach his eyes. He is looking for a bribe. In this court, access is a commodity. You fumble for a coin, a silver tetradrachm with the face of a Ptolemy on it, and press it into his palm. His fingers close over it like a trap. He nods, stepping aside just enough for you to squeeze through. As you pass under the massive cedarwood lintel of the gate, you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. You are walking into a military occupation. The palace isn't a home. It is a fortress held hostage by its own security detail. Historians still argue about the true loyalty of the Gabiniani during the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Were they loyal to the institution of the monarchy, or were they purely agents of chaos sold to the highest bidder? Most evidence suggests they sided with whoever let them kill the most people. They were the ones who, according to Caesar, had become accustomed to the license of the Alexandrian way of life, forgetting the discipline of Rome. They were the wild cards in the deck, capable of assassinating a general or overthrowing a monarch before breakfast. You walk into the outer courtyard, and the scale of the military presence is overwhelming. It's not just the Gabiniani. The Ptolemies, being a Greek dynasty ruling over Egyptians, never fully trusted their own subjects with weapons. So, the palace is stuffed with mercenaries from every corner of the known world. You see Galatians with their distinctive oval shields, Cretan archers testing their bowstrings, and Thracians with their terrifying curved swords. It's a United Nations of killers. You try to look inconspicuous as you cross the sun-baked plaza. You see a group of soldiers gambling in the shade of a colonnade. They are throwing dice made of sheep knuckles. One of them shouts in a guttural language, slamming his fist down. You realize that a dispute here doesn't end with a brawl. It ends with a sword in the gut. The violence is simmering just below the surface. These men have no allegiance to Egypt. They are here for the gold, the wine, and the power. If the pay stops, the loyalty stops. And let's not forget their most famous victim. As you walk past a statue of a sphinx, you recall the fate of Pompey the Great. When the legendary Roman general fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary after losing the Battle of Pharsalus, he thought he would be welcomed by the children of the king he had helped support. Instead, as he stepped off his boat, he was stabbed in the back. And who held the knife? Septimius, a former Roman centurion serving in the Gabiniani. These guards didn't just protect the palace. They actively shaped world history by murdering one of the most powerful men in Rome just to curry favor. You keep your head down, clutching your bag. You have passed the first test. You have bribed the wolf at the door. But as the heavy gates clang shut behind you, sealing you inside the Bruchion, you realize you have made a terrible mistake. You thought the walls were there to keep the mob out. But actually, they are there to keep you in with the monsters. The air inside the courtyard is still and hot. You are surrounded by marble, gold, and men who kill for a living. You have entered the Shark Tank. And as you move deeper into the complex, toward the residential wings where the Queen holds court, you are about to discover that the soldiers are the least of your worries. The soldiers, at least, are honest. You leave the heat and the menace of the mercenary courtyard behind and step through a towering set of bronze doors. The transition is instantaneous and jarring. The oppressive sun is replaced by a cool, fragrant breeze funneling through clerestory windows high above. The smell of sweat and leather vanishes, overtaken by the scent of cedar oil, beeswax, and crushed lily petals. You are now in the inner sanctum of the Ptolemies, the residential wing of the Bruchion. It is dazzlingly beautiful. You are standing on a floor of opus sectal intricate geometric patterns formed by cut slabs of porphyry, alabaster, and green serpentine marble. It's polished to such a high sheen that you can see your own dusty, terrified reflection looking back at you. The walls are plastered in vibrant reds and blues, adorned with gold leaf that catches the flickering light of oil lamps. It feels like you've stepped inside a jewelry box. You relax your shoulders. You let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. It's quiet here, peaceful, or so you think. You lean in to whisper a comment to yourself. Maybe something like, "Wow, this place is nicer than my apartment." Or perhaps, "I hope those guards didn't see my hidden stash of coins." You barely vocalize it. It's just a mutter, a breath of sound. Suddenly, a head turns. A servant standing 50 feet away, dusting a statue of Hermes, pauses and looks directly at you. His eyes narrow. He heard you. Every syllable. You have just walked into one of the most sophisticated surveillance systems of the ancient world. It's not electronic. It's architectural. The Ptolemies were Greeks, remember? They came from a culture that invented the amphitheater, a structure designed to carry a whisper from the stage to the back row without a microphone. In Alexandria, the city of scholars and engineers, they took that acoustic science and weaponized it. The vaulted ceilings of these corridors are not just aesthetic choices, they are acoustic mirrors. They are shaped to capture sound waves and bounce them along the curvature of the roof, depositing them with crystal clarity at specific focal points down the hall. You are essentially standing inside a giant ear. A mainstream historical fact that supports this is the advanced state of acoustic engineering in the Hellenistic world. The Roman architect Vitruvius, writing just a few decades after Cleopatra's death, described in detail how Greek theaters used bronze vessels tuned to specific musical notes, placed in niches under the seats, to amplify the actors' voices. The architects of Alexandria, who built the great lighthouse and the library, certainly had the math to create whispering galleries in the palace. It turns the simple act of walking down a hallway into a high-stakes game of keep quiet. You freeze, realizing that silence is your only defense. But even silence is hard to maintain on marble floors. The click-clack of your sandals sounds like gunshots in the stillness. You try to tiptoe, but the acoustics amplify the scuff of your soles. You feel exposed, naked. The paranoia sets in. Who is listening? Is there a scribe sitting in a hidden alcove with a wax tablet, recording the heavy breathing of the guests? Historians and archaeologists still argue about the extent of these listening posts. Some dismiss the idea of hidden tubes in the walls as Roman propaganda stories invented to make the Eastern monarchs seem devious and untrustworthy. They argue that the echoes are just a byproduct of grand stone architecture. But others point to the famous ear of Dionysius, in Syracuse, a limestone cave, carved with such acoustic perfection that the tyrant, Dionysius, could supposedly hear the prisoners plotting in the dungeon below. Given the close cultural ties between Syracuse and Alexandria, it is entirely plausible that Cleopatra's ancestors installed similar features to keep tabs on their treacherous courtiers. You continue walking, trying to glide like the servants do. You notice that the palace is filled with statues' beautiful, lifelike renderings of gods and former kings. You pass a statue of a woman pouring water from a jug. As you get close, you hear a faint whirring sound. A click. Then, water actually spills from the stone jug into a basin. You jump back. The statue moved. This brings us to the creepiest part of Alexandrian technology. You are in the home of Hero of Alexandria, or at least the intellectual tradition that produced him. Hero was an engineer who invented the steam engine, the eolipile, the vending machine, and intricate automata. The Ptolemies loved these toys. They had statues that could pour wine, mechanical birds that sang, and temple doors that opened automatically when a fire was lit. A quirky, fringe tidbit is that these automata were often used for psychological warfare or intimidation. There are accounts of large mechanical statues in royal processions that would stand up and sit down on their own. In the palace, a statue that moves might just be a party trick, or it might be a way to unnerve you. Imagine trying to have a secret conversation while a mechanical Nisa, a frantic, Bacchic woman, slowly turns her head to look at you, driven by hidden hydraulics. It creates an atmosphere where you can't trust your own eyes or ears. Is that a person standing still or a machine? Is that a statue or a spy? You find yourself holding your breath, terrified to make a sound. The beauty of the palace has transformed into a gilded cage. The luxury is oppressive. You realize that the queen doesn't need to put a guard in every room if the room itself does the work for her. Every surface is hard, reflective, and cold. There are no tapestries here to dampen the sound tapestries hide assassins after all. The Ptolemies prefer the open, echoey danger of stone. You pass a group of courtiers, men in fine linen, and women in diaphanous silks. They are talking, but their behavior is strange. They are leaning in so close their foreheads are almost touching. They are speaking into the folds of each other's sleeves. They know the rules. They know the walls are leaking. This is a court of mimes and lip readers. To survive here, you have to learn to communicate without broadcasting. You eventually reach a set of heavy curtains that seem to mark the entrance to a new wing. A eunuch stands guard. You recline onto a couch cushioned with silks imported from China, a luxury that costs more than a Roman senator earns in a year, and look out over the spread of food before you. To your starving eyes, it is a paradise. There are platters of roast ostrich glazed in honey, pyramids of figs bursting with redness, fresh oysters shipped in seawater jars from the Atlantic coast, and loaves of bread shaped like lotus flowers. The air is heavy with the scent of roast meat and galbanum incense. Your stomach gives a loud, embarrassing growl that the acoustic ceiling probably broadcasts to the entire room. You reach for a goblet of wine, condensation beating on the cool gold rim. Stop. Put the cup down. Do not eat. Do not drink. Do not even lick your lips until you have watched the man standing in the corner. He is the edietros, or in the Roman tradition, the pregustator. He is the royal taster. And in the court of Cleopatra, he has the most dangerous job description in the world. He is a human biological shield. Before a single morsel touches the queen's lips or yours, if you are a guest of honor, it must pass through his digestive system first. Watch him work. A servant brings a tray of sliced melons. The taster steps forward. He doesn't just nibble. He has to eat a significant portion to ensure the dose is effective. He chews slowly, his eyes scanning the room, perhaps looking for the person who might have bribed the cook. He swallows. Now comes the awkward part. The entire table waits. In modern fine dining, a pause in service is a faux pas. Here, it is a survival mechanism. You are waiting to see if he starts foaming at the mouth, clutching his throat, or turning a shade of blue that doesn't match the decor. After a few tense minutes, he nods. He is still standing. The queen takes a piece of melon. Now, and only now, are you allowed to eat. But as you chew, you can't help but wonder about the slow-acting poisons. What if it's not cyanide? What if it's something that takes an hour to kick in? The flavor of the melon suddenly tastes a lot like anxiety. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that toxicology was essentially a competitive sport in the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemies, along with their neighbors like Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, were obsessed with poisons and their antidotes, known as theriacs. They didn't just fear assassination. They industrialized it. Poison was cleaner than a knife, quieter than an arrow, and offered the killer a layer of plausible deniability. Oh, he died of a sudden fever. Sounds much better in the official records than I put monkshood in his soup. Cleopatra herself is not just a consumer of this science. She is a practitioner. She is a scholar queen, fluent in multiple languages and deeply educated in the sciences. Historians still argue whether the medical texts attributed to her in antiquity, such as Cosmeticon on cosmetics and soaps, and treatises on weights and measures, were actually written by her or simply ascribed to her name later. But the ancient sources are unanimous on one thing. She knew how to kill people with chemistry. There is a terrifying story recorded by the historian Pliny the Elder that illustrates this perfectly. It involves Mark Antony, who had become so paranoid about being poisoned by Cleopatra, a lover's quarrel, perhaps, that he insisted on having a taster for everything. At a banquet, Cleopatra grew tired of his distrust. She took the floral chaplet, the wreath of flowers from her own head, and dipped it into her wine cup. She then offered the cup to Antony, challenging him to drink to their love. Antony, caught up in the moment and seeing that she had handled the flowers, raised the cup. Just as it touched his lips, she stopped him. She called for a prisoner to be brought in. She ordered the prisoner to drink the wine. The man drank it and died instantly in convulsions. The flowers had been dipped in poison. Cleopatra looked at Antony and effectively said, "If I wanted you dead, a taster couldn't save you." That is the woman sitting at the head of the table. You look at the flower arrangement in front of you with deep suspicion. As the meal progresses, the tension never truly lifts. You notice that the wine is never left unattended. The cupbearers are under constant scrutiny. In this world, a moment of distraction is all it takes to slip a pinch of powdered arsenic or drop a venomous snake into a basket of figs, a method she supposedly used later for herself. You drink the wine a rich, sweet Mariotic vintage, but you sip it tentatively. You recall a quirky, fringe tidbit about the search for the perfect poison. Ancient writers claimed that Cleopatra tested various toxins on condemned prisoners to see which one produced the most peaceful death. She supposedly rejected belladonna because it caused screaming and convulsions, and rejected strychnine because it caused violent muscle spasms. She was looking for a poison that killed gently, like sleep. It's a chilling thought. This banquet hall might double as a laboratory, and the guests are just variables in an experiment. The feast continues. Servants bring out roasted meats, likely seasoned with garum, fermented fish sauce, and silphium. You eat because you are hungry, but you eat quickly, mimicking the queen's pace. If she stops eating a dish, you stop. If she skips the fish, you skip the fish. You are playing a culinary game of Simon Says, with a penalty for losing his death. But let's say you survive the main course. You haven't been poisoned. The taster is still standing, though he looks a bit full. You might think you can relax. But as the wine flows and the conversation turns to politics, you realize that the poison isn't the only toxicity in the room. The people sitting around you, the courtiers, the generals, and specifically the family members, you look around the banquet table, your belly full of questionably safe ostrich meat, and you start to notice the dynamics of the guests. Specifically, you notice the tension radiating from the royal family members. You might assume that a family dinner is a safe space, a time to relax. But in the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family dinner is usually where the warrants are signed. You are sitting in the middle of the most dysfunctional, blood-soaked family reunion in human history. To understand the danger you are in, you have to understand the family tree, or rather the family wreath, because it circles back on itself so many times it is impossible to tell where it starts or ends. The Ptolemies practiced incestuous marriage brother to sister, uncle to niece for generations. They claimed it was to keep the bloodline pure, mimicking the gods Isis and Osiris. But practically, it concentrated power so intensely that it turned every sibling into a rival. There were no spares in this dynasty. There were only threats. Look at Cleopatra herself. She didn't come to the throne peacefully. She came to power only after her father died, leaving the kingdom to her and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. They were supposed to rule jointly. They were supposed to get married. Instead, they immediately started a civil war. Ptolemy XIII, guided by his advisors, exiled Cleopatra to the desert. She had to raise an army of mercenaries to fight her own little brother. And how did that end? With Ptolemy XIII drowning in the Nile, weighed down by his golden armor, fleeing from Caesar's legions. But wait, there's more. After he died, she had to marry her other younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. He mysteriously dropped dead just a few years later, suspiciously close to the time Cleopatra gave birth to her son Caesarion, and needed a co-ruler slot to open up. Historians almost universally agree she had him poisoned. And let's not forget her sister, Arsinoe IV. Arsinoe sided with the rebels against Cleopatra, was captured by Rome, and dragged in Caesar's triumph. Cleopatra didn't forgive and forget. Years later, she convinced Mark Antony to have Arsinoe dragged out of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, a holy sanctuary, and executed on the steps. So, when you look at the young man sitting down the table, perhaps a distant cousin or a nephew, you aren't looking at a beloved relative. You are looking at a walking corpse. In this palace, if you share DNA with the monarch, your life expectancy drops to about 25. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this brutality is the nickname of one of Cleopatra's ancestors, Ptolemy VIII, Physcon. He was a piece of work. He married his sister, then seduced her daughter, his own niece, married her, and then, in a fit of rage, during a civil war, murdered his own son by his sister, chopped the body into pieces, and sent the parts to her as a birthday present. This is the genetic legacy sitting across from you. This is the normal behavior of the dynasty. You shift uncomfortably on your couch. You realize that the polite conversation happening around you is coded. When a courtier praises the queen's divine solitude, he is really saying, "Thank the gods she killed her brothers." When someone asks about the health of the children, they are calculating the odds of the next succession crisis. You recall a fringe historical tidbit about the Ptolemaic look. Coins and statues from the era often depict the later Ptolemies with distinct features: bulging eyes, hooked noses, and swollen necks, possibly a goiter or simply obesity. Some modern medical historians argue this might be evidence of genetic disorders caused by generations of inbreeding, such as Graves' disease or distinct familial deformities. Looking at the intense, almost manic expressions of the statues in the alcoves, you wonder if the madness of the family is biological as well as political. The danger for you, the guest, is proximity. If a purge starts tonight, if Cleopatra decides that her current co-ruler, her toddler son, is the only family she needs, anyone sitting near the wrong sibling is collateral damage. You don't want to be the guy who passes the salt to the person about to be arrested. You inch your goblet slightly away from the cousin on your left. As the wine continues to flow, you notice that the servants seem to be paying special attention to a particular door at the back of the hall. It's not the kitchen door. It's not the main entrance. It's a small, unassuming service entrance. But every time it opens, the conversation at the head table lulls slightly. The queen's eyes flit toward it. You realize that while the family members are the visible threat, they are often just the figureheads for the real power brokers. The siblings kill each other, yes, but who whispers in their ears? Who hands them the poison? Who organizes the army? The Ptolemies are Greek, but the administration is a bloated, complex bureaucracy adopted from the ancient pharaohs. And standing behind every throne, lurking in the shadows of every pillar, is a class of men who technically have no status, yet control the world. They are the eunuchs, the tutors, and the finance ministers. You watch as a man enters through that service door. He is dressed simply, but the guards snap to attention faster than they did for the general. He walks with a quiet, terrifying confidence. He approaches the queen and whispers something in her ear. She nods, her expression hardening. You have just spotted the true danger of the court. The siblings might hold the knife, but these men tell them where to point it. And unlike the royals, who have to worry about public image and dynastic legitimacy, these administrators operate in the dark. They are the gray eminences of Alexandria. And if you think the family reunions are deadly, wait until you meet the HR department. You watch the man in the plain robe withdraw from the queen's ear, bowing low with a fluidity that suggests a lack of spine, both metaphorically and perhaps literally. He retreats into the shadows, his eyes scanning the room, cataloging every glance and every whisper. He is not a prince. He is not a general. He is likely a eunuch, or perhaps a high-ranking tutor. And in the grand, terrifying chessboard of the Ptolemaic court, he is the piece that moves in ways you can't predict. While the royal siblings are the visible face of the dynasty, the ones on the coins and the statues. Machinery of the state is run by a class of men who are technically invisible. These are the philoi, the friends of the monarch, but friendship here is a transactional concept. You are currently looking at the gray eminences of Alexandria. They are the gatekeepers. If you want a contract to sell grain, a pardon for a crime, or just an audience with Cleopatra, you don't ask her. You ask them. And if they don't like you, you simply cease to exist in the eyes of the court. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the later Ptolemaic court was dominated by a triumvirate of administrators, the dioiks, finance minister, the royal tutor, and the chamberlain. The most infamous example occurred just before Cleopatra took sole control, during the reign of her brother, Ptolemy XIII. The boy king was essentially a puppet, dancing on the strings of three men: Pothinus, the eunuch regent, Achilles, the general, and Theodotus, the rhetoric tutor. These three men were the actual government. They were the ones who decided to murder Pompey the Great. They were the ones who started the war against Julius Caesar. The king just sat on the throne and nodded. You look at the eunuch standing by the pillar. He has no beard, his skin is smooth, and he carries a sense of physical softness that belies his ruthlessness. The Ptolemies, like many Eastern dynasties, relied heavily on eunuchs because, theoretically, they were the safest advisors. Since they couldn't have children, they couldn't start their own dynasties. They had no heirs to promote, so their loyalty should, in theory, be wholly directed toward the monarch. But in reality, this lack of family just made them incredibly ambitious for themselves. Pothinus, for example, didn't just serve Ptolemy XIII. He practically held him prisoner. He controlled the army, the treasury, and the food supply. He drove a wedge between the royal siblings to consolidate his own power. Standing in this room, you realize that the queen might be the one wearing the diadem, but she is surrounded by men who view her as a human resource to be managed, manipulated, or discarded if a better option comes along. You recall a quirky, fringe historical anecdote about Theodotus of Chios, the rhetoric tutor. When Pompey arrived in Egypt seeking refuge, the court debated what to do. Some said welcome him. Others said drive him away. Theodotus stood up and delivered a chillingly pragmatic speech. He argued that if they welcomed Pompey, they made Caesar an enemy. If they drove him away, Pompey would become an enemy. The only solution, he concluded with a smile, was to kill him. His reasoning? Dead men don't bite. This wasn't a general speaking. It was a debate teacher. And his logic led to one of the most significant political assassinations in antiquity. These are the minds you are dealing with, men, who treat human lives like rhetorical exercises. You take a sip of wine, trying to avoid eye contact with the administrative staff. You realize that access is the ultimate currency here. The chamberlain decides who enters the throne room. The secretary decides which letters the queen reads. You could be the most powerful merchant in the Mediterranean, but if the eunuch at the door decides he doesn't like your shoes, you will rot in the waiting room for weeks. This soft power is more terrifying than the Gabiniani guards outside because you can't fight it with a sword. It's a bureaucracy weaponized to suffocate you. Historians still argue about the extent of Cleopatra's independence from this system. Roman propaganda loved to portray her as a sorceress who controlled everyone, or conversely, as a weak woman dominated by her effeminate Eastern court, a common Roman trope to discredit foreign enemies. But modern scholarship suggests Cleopatra was the exception to the rule. Unlike her brother, she ruthlessly purged her court of these handlers early on. She likely had Pothinus executed. She kept her own counsel. But even she has her trusted inner circle, like Mardian the eunuch, who would stay loyal to her until the bitter end. The question is, are you sitting in a room where the queen is the master, or are you witnessing the quiet maneuvering of the next Pothinus? You notice a servant slipping a small roll of papyrus into the hand of the advisor you saw earlier. It's done so smoothly it looks like a magic trick. Information. That's the other weapon they wield. Alexandria is the city of the great library, but the palace is a library of secrets. These men know who is sleeping with who owes money to the Jewish bankers, and who has been sending secret letters to Rome. They are the NSA of the ancient world. As you watch the silent interplay of glances and nods, you feel a distinct chill. You are an outsider. You don't know the code. You don't know that scratching your nose might mean yes, and touching your ear might mean kill him. You are walking through a minefield blindfolded. The advisor turns and catches you staring. He doesn't look angry. He looks bored. To him, you are just another fleeting variable, a moth flying near the flame. He whispers something to a guard who glances at you. You suddenly feel the urge to leave, to fade into the background. You realize that in this court, being noticed by the administration is usually the first step toward being erased. But as you look away, focusing on the glittering crowd to distract yourself, you notice something else. It's not just the men who are dangerous. The women of the court, the queen's ladies-in-waiting, the noble wives, and Cleopatra herself, are armored in their own way. They aren't wearing bronze breastplates or carrying swords. They are wearing something far more subtle, and surprisingly, far more toxic. You focus on the woman sitting across from you. Her eyes are dark, dramatic pools, rimmed with heavy black coal. Her skin is pale, dusted with white powder. She looks stunning. But as you study the chemistry of her beauty, you remember what those powders are made of. You remember the lead. You remember the mercury. And you realize that the fashion trends of the Ptolemaic court are a slow-motion suicide pact. You lean forward, ostensibly to reach for another fig, but really to get a closer look at the woman seated directly across from you. She is a vision of high-status Alexandrian glamour. Her skin is the color of milk, a stark and expensive contrast to the sun-baked complexion of the common laborers outside. Her lips are a vivid, crushed berry red, and her eyes, those famous mesmerizing Egyptian eyes, are framed by thick, dark lines that extend outward toward her temples, making her gaze look both feline and divine. She looks like a goddess carved from marble and painted by a master. But if you were to scrape a sample of that face paint and run it through a mass spectrometer, the results would set off a hazmat alarm. You are looking at a walking periodic table of heavy metals. In the Ptolemaic court, beauty isn't just pain. It is a slow, neurological disintegration. Let's start with the eyes. The black eyeliner, known as Mesdemet or kohl, is the signature look of the dynasty. It's not just for style. It's practical. It cuts the glare of the relentless Egyptian sun, much like the grease paint used by modern football players, and it creates a barrier against the swarms of flies that carry eye diseases. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the primary ingredient in this black paste is galena, a mineral form of lead sulfide. That's right, lead, the heavy metal that we spent the 20th century frantically scrubbing out of our paint, gasoline, and plumbing because it causes brain damage, organ failure, and developmental delays. The courtiers around you are voluntarily grinding this stuff into a fine powder, mixing it with animal fat or oil, and smearing it directly onto the most sensitive, absorbent mucous membranes of their bodies. Every blink is a microdose of neurotoxin, but it gets more complicated. Historians and chemists still argue about the intent behind this toxic chemistry. In 2010, researchers from the Louvre analyzed samples of ancient Egyptian makeup and found something shocking. They didn't just find raw galena. They found two specific lead chlorides, lauryinite and phosgenite, that are incredibly rare in nature. This implies that the Egyptians were synthesizing these compounds using wet chemistry techniques, a level of chemical engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for thousands of years. Some scholars argue this proves the Egyptians knew exactly what they were doing and believed the lead compounds stimulated the immune system to produce nitric oxide, fighting off eye infections. In short, they view the makeup as a sophisticated antibiotic. Others argue that while it might have killed bacteria, the long-term cost of lead poisoning insomnia, irritability, and cognitive decline far outweighed the benefits of not having pink eye. Looking at the woman across from you, you notice her hand trembling slightly as she lifts her wine cup. Is it nerves? Or is it the lead attacking her nervous system? Now look at her skin. The desired aesthetic in the Hellenistic court is paleness. It signifies that you are rich enough to stay indoors, far away from the harsh labor of the fields. To achieve this ghostly complexion, women, and many men, use a foundation made of powdered ceruse. Ceruse is white lead. It creates a smooth, flawless, opaque finish that covers blemishes perfectly. Unfortunately, it also slowly eats the skin, causing gray patches, shriveled texture, and more blemishes, which then requires more ceruse to cover up. It is a vicious cycle of corrosive vanity. And those red lips? That's likely cinnabar or red ochre. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide. So, while she is absorbing lead through her eyes and cheeks, she is licking mercury off her lips every time she takes a sip of wine. Mercury poisoning is nasty stuff. It causes tremors, the hatter shakes, extreme mood swings, and eventually madness. Suddenly, the volatile behavior of the Ptolemaic family makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? You're sitting in a room full of people who have been rubbing neurotoxins into their pores since puberty. The paranoia, the murderous rages, the erratic decision-making, it might not just be bad genetics or political stress. It might be the makeup. You are dining in a ward of undiagnosed heavy metal poisoning victims who happen to have absolute power and armies at their disposal. But the chemical warfare doesn't stop at the face. You notice the woman's hair. It is a lustrous, deep black, without a single gray strand, despite her likely being in her 40s. How? A quirky, fringe tidbit of ancient cosmetology involves a dyeing recipe that uses lead oxide and calcium hydroxide, slaked lime. When mixed with water and applied to the hair, these chemicals react with the sulfur in the hair as keratin to form lead sulfide nanocrystals inside the hair shaft. It is essentially ancient nanotechnology. The crystals turn the hair black naturally, from the inside out. It's brilliant science. It's also incredibly toxic. If she sweats, that lead mixture runs down her neck and absorbs into her skin. If she runs her fingers through her hair and then eats a fig, she ingests it. The pursuit of eternal youth is literally killing her. You shift your gaze to the man sitting next to her. He is wearing a heavy wreath of flowers on his head, a standard party accessory in the ancient world. But the scent coming off him is overwhelming. It's a thick, cloying musk that makes your eyes water. The Egyptians were the perfume masters of the ancient world. exporting vast quantities of scented oils. But they didn't just dab it on their wrists. They bathed in it. The perfume cone is a bizarre fashion statement you might spot. It's a cone of ox tallow, animal fat, impregnated with myrrh, cinnamon, and other aromatics, balanced on top of a wig. As the party heats up, the fat melts, dripping scented grease down the wearer's hair and neck. It masks the smell of sweat, yes, but it also means everyone is slowly being basted like a turkey. The mix of melting fat, lead powder, and mercury paste creates a toxic sludge that coats the skin of the elite. You feel a sudden itch on your own face. The heat of the room, combined with the psychological horror of the chemistry lesson, is making you sweat. You wonder if the air itself is laced with lead dust. You take a sip of water, trying to flush your system, but you remember the wine cup might be made of pewter, which contains lead, or the water pipes might be lead. The Romans loved them, and the Ptolemies copied the best plumbing. There is no escape. The environment is saturated. You watch the queen herself at the head of the table. Cleopatra was famous for her immaculate appearance, though coins show she wasn't a classic beauty in the Hollywood sense. Her power lay in her voice, her charisma, and her intelligence. But she, too, would be painted in these poisons. It adds a tragic layer to her story. The woman who spoke 9 languages and charmed the most powerful men in Rome. Section 9. The arrival of the Romans sucks the oxygen right out of the room. One moment, the air is filled with the tinkle of sistrums and the murmur of gossip. The next, it is heavy with the silent, suffocating weight of judgment. You watch as the courtiers stiffen. The eunuchs retreat into the shadows. Even the queen, who never flinches, straightens her spine just a fraction. The men who have just marched in, led by a figure who radiates a terrifyingly casual authority, perhaps Julius Caesar himself, or one of his legates, are a visual shock. Amidst the shimmering silks, gold leaf, and diaphanous linens of the Egyptian court, the Romans look like boulders dropped into a flower bed. They are wearing togas made of heavy Italian wool, a fabric that smells of damp sheep and is completely unsuited for the Alexandrian heat. They are sweating, red-faced, and visibly uncomfortable, which only makes them angrier. You shrink back against your couch, trying to look insignificant. You are witnessing the collision of 2 worlds. On one side, the Hellenistic East, wealthy, cultured, ancient, and viewing itself as the pinnacle of civilization. On the other side, the Roman Republic, pragmatic, militaristic, brutally efficient, and viewing everything in this room as soft. To the Romans, the perfume cones, the makeup, and the eunuchs aren't signs of sophistication. They are symptoms of moral rot. They look at the golden goblets with a mix of greed and disgust. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that by the time Cleopatra sat on the throne, Egypt was technically an independent kingdom, but in reality, it was a client state living on borrowed time and borrowed money. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had bribed his way into Roman recognition by taking out colossal loans from Roman bankers, specifically a man named Rabirius Postumus. The debt was so massive that Rabirius was eventually installed as the royal finance minister to squeeze the Egyptian peasantry dry to pay himself back. So when these Romans walk in, they aren't just guests. They are the repo men. They own the furniture, the wine, and arguably, the crown itself. The diplomacy happening in front of you is a high-wire act where a single slip means annexation. You watch as Cleopatra greets the Roman leader. She doesn't bow. She speaks to him in his own language. She was the first Ptolemy to learn Egyptian, but she also spoke Latin. She charms him, but you can feel the danger in the interaction. The Romans have a deep-seated cultural misogyny. They don't respect queens. They barely respect women. To them, a woman ruling a nation is a biological anomaly, a freak of nature. Cleopatra has to navigate this prejudice while negotiating for her life. Historians still argue passionately about the nature of the relationship between Cleopatra and the Roman generals. Was it a romance of the century, a meeting of soulmates? Or was it purely a transaction? Did Caesar stay in Egypt because he was bewitched by the serpent of the Nile? Or did he stay because he needed Egyptian grain to feed the mob in Rome and Egyptian gold to pay his legions? Looking at the way the Roman officers are eyeing the platters of food like wolves, you suspect the grain and gold theory holds a lot of weight. As the Romans settle onto the couches, awkwardly, as they prefer a different dining posture, a quirky, fringe tidbit of cultural friction plays out. The Romans absolutely hated the influence of eunuchs. To a Roman man whose identity was wrapped up in virtues, manly courage and virility, the idea of a castrated man holding political power was an abomination. You see a Roman legate sneer at Pothinus or Mardian. It's not just a rude look. It's a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. The Romans called the Alexandrians Greculi, little Greeks, a derogatory term implying they were frivolous, chatty, and unreliable. You are sitting in the crossfire of this cultural Cold War. If you laugh at a Greek joke, you offend the Romans. If you praise Roman strength, you look like a traitor to the queen. You stare at your plate, wishing you could disappear. The conversation turns to politics. The Romans are blunt. They ask about troop numbers. They ask about the harvest yield. They act as if they are auditing a subsidiary company. You realize that the luxury around you, the very thing that makes the palace so dangerous with its poisons and plots, is also its only defense. Cleopatra has to dazzle them. She has to prove that Egypt is too valuable to be destroyed, that it is a golden goose that lays better eggs when it's alive. But there is a specific danger in having Caesar or Antony in the living room. The Gabiniani guards outside, the ones who murdered Pompey, are sweating. They are Roman deserters facing their former commander. The tension is palpable. Will Caesar order their execution? Will they assassinate him to save themselves? You are dining in a room where everyone has a weapon and a motive. The banquet drags on. The Romans drink the wine, but they don't seem to get drunk. They get louder, more assertive. One of them knocks over a vase, shattering it. The room goes silent. He laughs. It's a power move. He's showing that he can break things, and no one can stop him. You realize that for all the queen's poisons and trapdoors, she is vulnerable here. The legions are parked on the lawn. The fleet is in the harbor. The palace walls can keep out the mob, but they can't keep out the geopolitical reality that Rome is devouring the Mediterranean. As the dinner finally breaks up and the Romans march out to their own quarters, or perhaps to the queen's bedchamber, depending on the timeline, you feel exhausted. The mental energy required to survive a cocktail party with the conquerors of the world is draining. You need to escape the suffocating pressure of the court. You need a place where the Romans aren't watching, a place of quiet, a place of knowledge. You slip away from the banquet hall, heading deeper into the complex. You aim for the one place that Alexandria is most famous for, the place that holds the sum of human knowledge. You think it will be a sanctuary, a library. But as you walk through the colonnaded walkways toward the great library, you forget that knowledge is power. And in a dictatorship, power is guarded just as ruthlessly as the treasury. You are about to enter the stacks, but you won't find a kindly librarian shushing you. You will find that the stacks are a battleground for information control, and reading the wrong scroll can get you erased from history. You slip away from the suffocating political theater of the banquet hall, leaving the Romans and the Ptolemies to their high-stakes staring contest. You need air. You need quiet. You need to get as far away from the potential stabbing as possible. You head toward the Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, the massive university complex that houses the most famous institution in the ancient world, the Great Library of Alexandria. You probably picture a library as a benevolent public space with comfy chairs and free Wi-Fi. Erase that image. The Great Library is not a public service. It is a weapon of the state. It is a research facility attached to the palace, funded by the crown, and populated by a collection of the smartest, most arrogant, and most competitive men on earth. It is a fortress of information dominance. You walk through the colonnaded walkways, passing statues of thinkers like Aristotle and Strabo. The air here is different drier, smelling intensely of cedar oil used to protect scrolls from worms and old papyrus. It's a smell that screams intellectual power, but as you approach the entrance, you are stopped by a guard. Not a librarian in a cardigan, but a soldier with a spear. Access to the stacks is restricted. Knowledge is dangerous, and the Ptolemies don't want just anyone reading the blueprints to a catapult or the geography of the Nile source. You flash the seal of a visiting scholar, or perhaps you bribe him with the last of your silver, and you are let in. You step into a vast hall lined with armaria wooden pigeonholes, packed with scrolls. There are hundreds of thousands of them. It is overwhelming. This is the brain of the Mediterranean. But as you walk the aisles, you realize that this collection wasn't built on donations. It was built on theft. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the Ptolemies were obsessive hoarders of books. They instituted a law called the Ship's Fund. Any ship that docked in Alexandria was searched, not for drugs or weapons, but for books. If a scroll was found, it was confiscated, taken to the library, copied by scribes, and then here's the kicker. A copy was given back to the owner, while the library kept the original. They literally stole the intellectual property of the entire world, one ship at a time. It was state-sponsored piracy for the sake of a bibliography. You see a group of scholars huddled at a table, arguing in hushed, furious whispers. They are the philologoi, the philologists and literary critics. They live here, tax-free, with free food and lodging provided by the king. The satirist Timon of Phlius famously called them fatted fowls in a coop, pecking at each other in the cage of the muses. It sounds like a sweet gig until you realize they are prisoners. A quirky fringe tidbit involves Aristophanes of Byzantium, one of the head librarians. When the king of Pergamon, a rival dynasty, tried to poach him to run their competing library, the Ptolemies didn't offer him a raise. They threw him in prison. In Alexandria, you don't quit your job. You serve until you die, because the state owns your brain. The danger here isn't physical violence, like in the banquet hall. It's the danger of being an asset that is too valuable to lose. You pull a scroll from a shelf carefully, using both hands. The papyrus is brittle. It crackles. You are holding the only copy of a lost play by Aeschylus, or a map of the world by Eratosthenes. The weight of it is terrifying. If you tear it, you are destroying history. But there is a greater danger looming over these shelves than a clumsy tourist. You are standing in a fire trap. Papyrus is dried reed. It is essentially highly organized kindling. And you are in a building lit by oil lamps. The vulnerability of this place is palpable. Historians still argue fiercely about the burning of the library. Did Julius Caesar accidentally burn it down during the Civil War, which is happening right now in our timeline, when he set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor? Did the fire spread from the docks to the library warehouses? Or did the library survive, only to be destroyed later by Christians or Muslims? Most modern scholars believe Caesar burned a warehouse full of grain and scrolls near the docks, destroying about 40,000 volumes. But the main library in the palace survived for a while. But standing here, surrounded by dry paper and open flames, knowing that Caesar's legions are currently engaged in urban warfare just a few blocks away, you feel the fragility of it all. You are standing in a memory palace built on a fuse. You move deeper into the archives, looking for a quiet corner. You find a section dedicated to history. You unroll a scroll that details the history of the pharaohs. But as you read, you notice weird gaps, erasures, corrections written in a different hand. This is the political danger of the library. The Ptolemies controlled the past to justify their present. They paid the priest Manetho to write the Egyptiaca, the definitive history of Egypt, specifically to link their Greek dynasty to the ancient pharaohs. They curated the narrative. If you were to find a scroll that contradicted the official story, say, a text claiming the Ptolemies were illegitimate usurpers, you wouldn't just be reading a book. You would be holding treason. You glance over your shoulder. A scholar is watching you. He looks suspicious. In this environment, academic rivalry is deadly. If he accuses you of damaging a scroll or reading forbidden texts, there is no appeal process. The head librarian is appointed by the king and often doubles as the crown prince's tutor. The hierarchy of the library is the hierarchy of the state. You roll the scroll back up, your hands shaking slightly. You realize that the library isn't a sanctuary of truth. It's a factory of propaganda. It creates the legitimacy that keeps the queen on the throne. The forbidden's knowledge isn't magic spells. It's the unfiltered truth about who holds power and how they got it. You decide that being surrounded by thousands of flammable objects while a war is brewing outside is a bad strategic position. You place the scroll back in its pigeonhole. You walk quickly toward the exit, trying to look like you just came in to check a reference on agricultural yields. As you step back out into the blinding sun of the courtyard, you feel a sense of loss. You know, with the benefit of hindsight, that most of what you just saw will vanish. The plays, the maps, the histories, they will turn to ash, leaving us with fragments and guesses. You have just walked through the greatest tragedy of the ancient world before it happened. But you have no time to mourn the books. You have to survive the rest of the day. The sun is high now, baking the limestone. You need to find a place that is sacred, a place where the gods might offer some protection that the politicians and scholars cannot. You head toward the temple comp. You step out of the cool, dry air of the library and back into the sweltering heat of the afternoon. But this time, the heat feels heavier. It's humid, cloying, and smells faintly of standing water and musk. You are heading toward the sacred precinct within the palace grounds. You might think, after the library and the banquet, that you've seen enough of the Greek side of Alexandria. Now, you are about to encounter the Egyptian side. And let me tell you, while the Greeks might poison your wine, the Egyptian gods prefer to eat you whole. You pass through a pylon gate covered in hieroglyphs, a stark contrast to the Hellenistic columns you saw earlier. The Ptolemies were masters of branding. To their Greek subjects, they were successors of Alexander. To their Egyptian subjects, they were pharaohs, living gods responsible for maintaining cosmic order. To prove this, they built lavish temples to the native deities right in their own backyard. You are approaching the shrine of Sobek, the crocodile god of strength, fertility, and military prowess. You enter a courtyard dominated by a massive rectangular tank made of polished granite. The water is murky, green with algae, and still, too still. You stand at the edge, peering over the low marble wall. At first, you see nothing but the reflection of the sun. Then, a log floats to the surface. But logs don't have eyes. A massive armored head breaks the water. It is a Nile crocodile, easily 15 feet long. But this isn't a wild animal you'd see on a safari. This creature is wearing jewelry. I'm not joking. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that in temples dedicated to Sobek, most famously at Crocodilopolis, but also here in the capital, the priests kept a living crocodile known as the Suchus. This animal was considered the living incarnation of the god, and because he was a god, he had to be dressed like one. Shutterstock Explorer, you squint and see that its front claws are adorned with gold bracelets. Its ears, or the slits where ears would be, are pierced with gold rings set with glass gems. It is a terrifying mix of prehistoric violence and high fashion. You watch as a priest approaches the edge of the tank. He is wearing the leopard skin sash of the high clergy. He isn't carrying a weapon. He is carrying a platter of roast meat and honey cakes. He beckons you forward. Apparently, it is lucky for a visitor to present an offering to the god. You hesitate. You look at the priest, then at the crocodile, then at your own attached hands, which you are quite fond of. The priest makes a soothing sound, splashing the water gently. The beast paddles closer, the gold bangles clinking against the stone. It opens its jaws, revealing a cavern of pink flesh and serrated teeth. The priest calmly reaches out and pries the jaws open further. This brings us to one of the most bizarre and quirky fringe tidbits of ancient tourism. The Greek geographer Strabo visited one of these temples and left a detailed, horrified account of the feeding ritual. He watched as priests forced the crocodile's mouth open, shoved cakes and meat down its throat, and then poured a jar of wine in after it. Then the crocodile would splash away, presumably to sleep off the hangover. It sounds like a frat party prank, but it was a sacred rite. You are handed a piece of honey cake. The priest nods at you. He wants you to toss it in. You lean over the rail. The crocodile fixes you with a cold, reptilian stare. This animal has been hand-fed its entire life, so it associates humans with food. But does it distinguish between the cake and the hand holding it? That's the gamble. You toss the cake. The jaws snap shut with a sound like a pistol crack, sending a spray of water onto your tunic. You jump back, heart hammering. The priest smiles. The god accepts your offering. You are safe. But this ritual highlights a deep scholarly debate about the Ptolemaic court. Historians still argue about the extent of this syncretism, the blending of Greek and Egyptian beliefs. Did Cleopatra and her ancestors actually believe in the divinity of this crocodile? Or was this entire temple complex just an expensive piece of political theater designed to keep the native priesthood happy? The Ptolemies were famous for cynically manipulating religion. They created the god Serapis, a mashup of Osiris and Zeus, specifically to unite the two cultures. Standing here, wiping crocodile water off your face, you wonder if the queen ever comes here to feed the beast, or if she stays in her ivory tower, laughing at the absurdity of putting earrings on a reptile. However, the danger here isn't just about losing a finger. It's about the volatility of the animal itself. These tame crocodiles were still wild animals. There are accounts of them snapping, grabbing priests, or deciding that they didn't want the honey cake today. Being in the presence of a predator that is treated like a pet creates a false sense of security that is lethal. You are one slip on the wet pavement away from falling into the tank. And if you fall in, no amount of gold jewelry is going to stop the suckos from doing what millions of years of evolution designed it to do. You back away from the tank, eager to put some distance between yourself and the living god. You retreat into the shadows of the colonnade, trying to slow your breathing. The heat in the courtyard is stifling. The smell of the stagnant water clings to you. You realize that the exotic allure of Egypt, the very thing that fascinated Caesar and Antony, is built on a foundation of primal, unpredictable nature. The Ptolemies tried to pave it with marble and dress it in gold, but the crocodile is always waiting just beneath the surface. As you leave the temple precinct, you notice a narrow channel of water running alongside the path. It feeds into the crocodile tank, but it also connects to a deeper, darker system. You follow it with your eyes. It leads toward a structure that looks like a deep well, guarded by soldiers who look far more serious than the temple priests. You have stumbled upon the most critical, high-stakes instrument in the entire kingdom. It's not a weapon. It's not a vault. It's a measuring stick. You are about to see the nilometer. You see, the crocodile tank wasn't just for worship. It was connected to the river, and the level of the water in that tank tells the priests and the queen everything they need to know about the future. In an agricultural society dependent on the annual flood, the water level is the difference between life and death. And right now, the water looks low. Too low. You realize that while you were worried about being eaten by a crocodile, the queen is worried about something much worse: famine. And when the river fails, the mob you met earlier doesn't just throw rocks. They burn the palace down. You are walking from a religious danger into an existential one. The water is dropping, and the temperature of the city is rising. You follow the stone channel, leading away from the crocodile temple, expecting it to drain into a garden or perhaps a decorative fountain. Instead, it leads you to a structure that looks deceptively simple from the outside. A small, round building with a conical roof, guarded by soldiers who are notably more alert than the ones at the main gate. They aren't watching the horizon. They are watching the ground. You have arrived at the nilometer. You manage to peer past the guards, perhaps utilizing that visiting scholar status you claimed at the library, and look inside. It isn't a room. It's a shaft. A deep, limestone-lined pit with a staircase spiraling down into the darkness. At the bottom, connecting to the water table and the river, is a pool of dark, still water. Carved into the central pillar or the walls of the shaft are horizontal markings, spaced out in cubits and fingers. This is not just a ruler in a well. It is the most important political instrument in the entire kingdom. It is the dashboard for the engine of Egypt. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the Egyptian economy, and by extension, the stability of Cleopatra's throne, was 100% dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile. Every summer, monsoon rains in Ethiopia would swell the river, sending a pulse of water downstream that deposited rich, black silt onto the farmland. If the water rose to 16 cubits, it was the plenitude, a perfect harvest. If it rose only to 12 cubits, it meant famine. If it rose to 19 cubits, it meant devastating floods that swept away villages. You look down the shaft. The water level is currently hovering near the lower marks. The air in the shaft smells of wet limestone and anxiety. You realize that this device determines the tax rate. The moment the priests read the level, the scribes calculate the harvest yield before a single seed has been sown. If the water is high, taxes go up. If the water is low, the queen has a massive problem. She can't tax a starving peasant. And worse, a starving peasant doesn't care about the divinity of the pharaoh. He cares about bread. This brings us to a fascinating area of modern scholarly debate. Historians and climatologists have recently begun cross-referencing ancient Egyptian records of failed Niles with ice core data from the Arctic. They found a smoking gun. During Cleopatra's reign, specifically in the 40s BC, there were massive volcanic eruptions, likely the Okmok volcano in Alaska, that spewed ash into the stratosphere, cooling the global climate and disrupting the monsoon rains. So, historians argue that the political chaos of Cleopatra's reign, the riots, the weakness of the state, the desperation to ally with Rome, wasn't just about bad politics. It was about bad weather. The queen was fighting a climate apocalypse. When you look down that well, you aren't just seeing water. You are seeing the geological bad luck that doomed a dynasty. A quirky fringe tidbit about the nilometer is the secrecy surrounding it. In earlier times, and likely continuing into the Ptolemaic era, the priesthood treated the water level as a state secret. They would descend into the pit, read the measurement, and then announced to the public whether the gods were pleased or angry. It allowed them to manipulate the populace. If the river was low, they could claim the queen hadn't performed the rituals correctly, undermining her authority. Or, if the river was high, they could claim credit for their prayers. It was a theological weatherman forecast that could topple a government. You watch as a priest descends the stairs, holding a torch. He pauses at the water's edge, crouching to get an exact reading. He traces the line with his finger. He doesn't look happy. He ascends the stairs slowly, whispering to a scribe waiting at the top. The scribe's face goes pale. He hurries off toward the palace. The news is bad. The river is failing. You feel a shift in the atmosphere. The luxury of the palace, the gold, the incense, the imported wine, suddenly looks incredibly fragile. It is all built on the back of that rising water. Without the flood, the granary's empty. When the granary's empty, the mob you met on the Canopic Way gets hungry. And when the Alexandrian mob gets hungry, they don't file complaints. They besiege the palace. You realize that your safety within these walls is an illusion. You are trapped in a golden cage with a starving beast pacing outside. The Romans in the guest wing, the Gabiniani in the courtyard, the poisoner at the banquet, none of them matter if the grain shipments stop. You walk away from the nilometer, looking up at the sky. It is a brilliant, cloudless blue. But to an Egyptian, a cloudless sky without the flood is a curse. You sense the panic beginning to ripple through the administrative wing. Servants are running faster. Guards are checking their weapons. The queen is likely already in a strategy meeting, figuring out which grain reserves to open and which riots to suppress. You decide that the ground floor is becoming too dangerous. The tension is rising like the heat. You need a vantage point. You need to see what's coming. You head for the upper terraces of the palace, the royal balconies that overlook the harbor and the city. You want a view. But as you step out onto the terrace, expecting a panoramic vista of the Mediterranean sunset, you find that the view has changed. The harbor isn't filled with merchant ships anymore. It's filled with warships. And looking down into the streets, you see the first plumes of smoke rising. The famine hasn't even hit yet, but the war has. The Romans aren't just guests anymore. They are occupiers. And the citizens of Alexandria have decided to light the fuse. You rush up the marble staircase, your sandals slapping against the cool stone, desperate to get above the stifling tension of the lower levels. You emerge onto a wide, colonnaded terrace that offers a panoramic view of the great harbor. In peacetime, this would be the most expensive real estate in the world, a place to sip wine and watch the merchant galleys arrive from Tyre and Athens. But as you step to the railing, the wind whipping at your tunic, you realize that the postcard view has been replaced by a panorama of apocalypse. The harbor is on fire. You are witnessing the start of the Alexandrian War, 4847 BC. The tension you felt earlier, the hungry mob, the arrogant Romans, the failing river, has finally snapped. The citizens of Alexandria, led by the queen's sister Arsinoe and the eunuch Ganymedes, have laid siege to the palace. You are no longer in a royal residence. You are in a bunker. Looking down from the terrace, you see the famous Ptolemaic fleet triremes and quinqueremes that were the pride of the Mediterranean engulfed in flames. Julius Caesar, realizing he was outnumbered and trapped in the palace quarter, ordered the ships burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. It is a tactical decision, but the consequences are catastrophic. The fire is jumping from ship to ship, driven by the strong north wind. And then you see the flames leap onto the docks. This brings us to the most controversial moment in Alexandrian history. You watch in horror as the fire spreads to the warehouses lining the harbor. These warehouses are filled with grain, yes, but also with overflow from the library. Thousands of scrolls accounting records, poetry, histories are turning into black smoke before your eyes. You are watching the burning of the library in real time. It's not the main building which is behind you, but the loss of knowledge is staggering. The smell of burning papyrus is distinct, acrid, and sweet, like burning autumn leaves. But the danger isn't just the fire. It's the siege itself. The Alexandrians are not using brute force. They are using engineering. They are cutting off the water. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that Alexandria didn't have fresh springs. It relied on a complex system of aqueducts and underground cisterns that brought water from the Nile. The besieging army, knowing the city's infrastructure perfectly, has blocked the fresh water channels and started pumping seawater into the pipes leading to the palace. Imagine the scene inside the palace. You run to a fountain to get a drink, desperate to cool down. You take a sip. It's salt. Panic spreads instantly. The legions are thirsty. The courtiers are thirsty. The queen is thirsty. The luxury of the palace has evaporated, leaving you trapped in a marble box with no way to hydrate. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, eventually orders his men to dig wells right there in the courtyard, hitting a freshwater aquifer and saving the day. But the psychological terror of the saltwater panic stays with you. From your balcony vantage point, you can see the fighting in the streets. It is urban warfare at its most brutal. The Alexandrians are fighting from the rooftops. Remember those stockpiled stones? They have barricaded the wide avenues. The Roman legions, usually masters of open field battles, are struggling in the tight alleys. You see centurions fighting shield to shield against local militia, armed with whatever they could grab. A quirky fringe tidbit about this war is the swimming lesson of Julius Caesar. Later in the siege, during a battle for control of the Pharos Mole, the causeway, the Romans are routed. Caesar is cut off. To escape, he has to jump into the harbor and swim for his life to a nearby ship. The legend says he swam with one hand while holding vital documents above the water with the other to keep them dry, dragging his purple general's cloak in his teeth. Looking at the chaotic, debris-filled water below, you realize that even the most powerful man in the world is just one bad stroke away from drowning in the muck of Alexandria. The view from the terrace shifts your perspective on the palace entirely. It wasn't built for this. The wide windows, perfect for catching the breeze, are now liabilities that let in arrows. The decorative gardens are now killing fields. You see Roman soldiers cutting down the queen's palm trees to build barricades. The sacred crocodiles you fed earlier? They've probably been eaten by the starving garrison. Historians still argue about how close Cleopatra came to losing everything right here. We think of her reign as long and glamorous, but in this moment, she is a prisoner in her own home, betting everything on a Roman general who is currently wet, outnumbered, and burning down her city. If a single arrow hits Caesar, or if the mob breaches the gates, the Ptolemaic dynasty ends tonight, not with an asp, but with a lynching. As night falls, the glow of the burning ships illuminates the palace with a flickering, hellish orange light. The shadows of the columns stretch out like prison bars. You realize you can't stay on the balcony. You are a silhouette against the fire, a perfect target for an archer on a nearby roof. You retreat inside, but the interior is no longer a sanctuary. The halls are filled with wounded soldiers. The marble floors are slick with blood and salt water. The servants have vanished, or they are hiding in the cellars. The glamour of the court has been stripped away, revealing the raw, violent machinery of power underneath. You need to find a way out. But the gates are barred, and the harbor is on fire. There is only one place left to go, a place that the queen has been preparing for years, a place that sits quietly in the middle of the chaos, waiting for the inevitable end. You head toward the royal mausoleum. You flee the smoke-filled corridors of the residential wing, seeking refuge from the screams of the siege and the encroaching fire. You stumble through a set of heavy doors that lead away from the harbor toward the Temple of Isis. You expect to find another courtyard, another garden, or perhaps a barracks. Instead, you find a construction site. But this isn't for a new guest wing or a ballroom. You are standing in the shadow of a colossal monument that is rising amidst the living quarters, a structure of white alabaster and gold that gleams even in the darkness. You have found the mausoleum. To the modern mind, living next door to your own grave seems morbid, bordering on psychotic. But for the Ptolemies, it was practical. And for Cleopatra, it is strategic. You walk through the unfinished archways, stepping over piles of limestone dust and discarded tools. The air here is cool, thick with the smell of wet plaster and incense. It has quiet a tomb-like silence that stands in stark contrast to the war raging just a few hundred yards away. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that Cleopatra was preparing for her death long before Octavian's legions showed up. She built her mausoleum right next to her palace, incorporating it into the royal compound. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a 2-story temple, towering and majestic, designed to hold her body and Mark Antony's. But right now, as you peer into the inner chambers, you realize it's not empty. It's already being used, but not for bodies. It's a vault. You see crates stacked to the ceiling. You pry one open. It glimmers. Gold plate, emeralds, pearls the size of grapes, rolls of silk. The queen is moving the treasury into the tomb. Why? Because this building is her final bargaining chip. A quirky, fringe tidbit that reveals the true danger of this place is Cleopatra scorched earth insurance policy. Ancient sources tell us that alongside the gold and gems, she packed the mausoleum with vast quantities of flax, hemp, tow, and aromatic oils, highly flammable materials. The plan was simple. If the Romans broke through and tried to take her alive, she would light a match. She would burn the entire fortune of the Ptolemies, leaving the conquerors with nothing but ash. You are standing in the most expensive fire trap in history. It is a suicide bomb made of gold. You walk deeper into the structure. The walls are already painted with scenes of the afterlife, depicting Cleopatra in the company of the gods. It is surreal to see the face of the woman who is currently shouting orders in the war room, depicted as a serene, immortal spirit on the wall. It blurs the line between the living queen and the dead legend. You realize that she has accepted her fate. She knows that in this Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no retirement home for a pharaoh. The upper level of the mausoleum is designed with a mechanism that is particularly chilling. History records that when a dying Mark Antony was brought to her, after stabbing himself in a botched suicide attempt, the doors of the tomb were already sealed against the Romans. Cleopatra and her ladies had to lower ropes from an upper window and hoist the dying general up by hand. Imagine the physical and emotional horror of that moment. The Queen of Egypt, covered in blood, dragging her lover's heavy, dying body up the side of her own grave. The structure you are standing in is built for tragedy. Historians and archaeologists still argue fiercely about where this building actually is. Most believe it sunk into the harbor centuries ago during the great earthquakes that claimed the palace, now lying somewhere under the murky water near the modern citadel of Cape Bay. Others, like the archaeologist Kathleen Martinez, believe she might have built a decoy tomb at Taposiris Magna, miles west of the city, to fool the Romans. But standing here, in the heart of the palace complex, the debate feels irrelevant. The tomb is here, a looming reminder of mortality. You find a small side chamber that looks like an apothecary. Jars of liquids line the shelves. You pick one up. It's heavy. You smell it, bitter almonds, cobra venom. This is the preparation room. Remember the prisoners she tested poisons on? This is where she stored the results. This building is the ultimate exit strategy. It contains the wealth to buy a kingdom, the fuel to burn it, and the poison to leave it. You sit on a block of unfinished marble, the weight of the situation crushing you. The palace isn't a home. It isn't a seat of government. It is a waiting room for death. The luxury, the politics, the wars, it all ends here, in this quiet, flammable room. The queen has built her own end of the script into the architecture. Suddenly, a tremor shakes the ground. A siege engine has hit the outer wall. Dust falls from the ceiling of the tomb. The war is getting closer. The sanctuary of the mausoleum is about to be breached. You realize that if you stay here, you will either be burned alive with the treasure or captured by the legions. You are not a queen. You don't have a suicide pact with history. You need to get out. You look toward the high windows of the tomb. You can see the smoke from the harbor, but beyond it, the open sea. The exit. The dynasty is falling. The lights are going out in Alexandria. It is time to leave the Ptolemaic dream before he becomes a nightmare. The dust from the ceiling of the mausoleum settles in your hair, a fine white powder that smells of crushed limestone and the end of an era. The tremor from the siege engine has stopped, but the silence that follows is brittle. You know what comes next. The Romans are methodical. They don't just knock on the door. They dismantle the house. You can't stay here in this golden fire trap. You have to move. You slip out of the tomb's side entrance, stepping back into the chaos of the palace grounds. But the palace you entered, the one of whispering eunuchs and lead-lined beauty, is gone. It has been unstuck in time. The manicured gardens are trampled by legionary boots. The fountains are running dry or red. The air is thick with the smell of burning cedar from the library warehouses and the metallic tang of blood. You are walking through the wreckage of the Hellenistic world. You make your way toward the harbor, dodging patrols of Gabiniani, who are now frantically switching sides, stripping off their Egyptian sashes to look more Roman before the victors arrive. You spot a small skiff bobbing near a private quay, likely a smuggling vessel used by the servants to bring in contraband wine. It's your ticket out. As you untie the rope, your hands trembling, you look back one last time at the Breccian. From this distance, you can see the full scope of the tragedy. You see the balcony where you watched the fleet burn. You see the window of the banquet hall where you ate the poisoned food. And you see the Queen's quarters, the epicenter of the storm. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the fall of this palace didn't just mark the end of a queen. It marked the end of ancient Egypt as an independent entity. For 3,000 years, pharaohs had ruled this land. But after Cleopatra's death, Egypt became the personal property of the Roman emperor, essentially a giant private farm to feed Rome. The Ptolemaic dream of a multicultural Greek-Egyptian empire died right here, replaced by the cold efficiency of a Roman province. You push the boat off, the oars cutting silently into the dark water. You row away from the Lochias promontory, putting distance between yourself and the inevitable suicide pact. But as you drift into the wider harbor, you can help but think about the final scene of the script that you are leaving behind. You know how it ends. We all do. The asp, the basket of figs, the tragic tableau of the queen found dead on her golden couch, her two handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, dying at her feet. It is the most famous death scene in history. But here's a fringe, quirky tidbit to chew on as you row. The snake probably wasn't a cobra. A cobra is huge 5 to 6 feet long. It's hard to hide one in a basket of figs without someone noticing a giant, angry reptile. Furthermore, a cobra bite is messy, painful, and causes gruesome swelling and necrosis. It's not the peaceful sleep Cleopatra wanted. Many ancient toxicologists believe she likely used an Egyptian asp, Cerastes cerastes, or the horned viper, or, even more likely, she didn't use a snake at all. She probably used a hollow hair pin filled with that potent, sleep-inducing toxin she spent years perfecting in her laboratory. The snake was just a dramatic prop for the story, a final symbol of her divinity as the reincarnation of Isis. Historians still argue fiercely about whether she even committed suicide. Some modern criminologists suggest that Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, had her murdered. Think about it. He needed her dead to secure his rule, but he couldn't execute a woman and a queen without looking like a monster. A suicide was the perfect solution. It cleaned up the mess and let him play the benevolent conqueror who arrived too late to save her. Was the most powerful woman in the world really the type to give up, or was she silenced? As you watch the lights of the palace fade, you realize that history is just the version of events written by the guy who didn't drink the poison. You look up. The great lighthouse, the Pharos, is still there, looming over the harbor. But its light seems different now. It's no longer a beacon of surveillance and power. It's a tombstone. It's a monument to a civilization that flew too close to the sun. The mirror that could burn ships is dark, obscured by the smoke of the burning library. You row past the breakwater, the gentle swell of the Mediterranean lifting your small boat. The noise of the riots, the screams of the siege, and the whispers of the court fade into the background, replaced by the rhythmic shush of the waves. You have escaped. You survived the mob. You survived the mercenaries. You survived the dinner party. You survived the makeup. You are leaving behind a world where luxury was a weapon and beauty was a toxin. You are drifting back toward the safety of the timeline, back to a world where gluten-free is a dietary choice, not a famine warning, and where the only thing in your eyeliner is pigment, not lead. And just like that, the smoke of the burning harbor fades into the cool, clean air of your bedroom. The blinding glare of the Pharos lighthouse softens, dissolving into the gentle, reassuring darkness of your own home. The rhythmic slap of the oars against the water slows down, matching the steady, calm beating of your heart. You are safe. You are no longer navigating the treacherous currents of the Nile or dodging the sharp gaze of a Roman centurion. The marble floors that echoed with your footsteps are gone, replaced by the soft, welcoming texture of your sheets. The tension in your shoulders, the tension of needing to watch every shadow and taste every grape melts away. Take a deep breath. Inhale the quiet. There is no heavy perfume here, no cloying scent of melting ox fat or burning cedar. Just the neutral, peaceful air of the present. You don't need to check the locks. You don't need to bribe a guard. You don't need to worry about the river level. Let your mind drift away from the glittering, dangerous court of the Ptolemies. Let the gold and the poison fade into a harmless dream. The history book is closed. The dynasty has fallen, but you are still here, warm and rested. The only thing you have to rule over tonight is the kingdom of sleep.